In Turkey, both the Turkish film industry and environmental movements made progress after 1990s. Starting from the late 90s, Turkish cinema, after a long time, saw box office success with popular films, also gained awards at international film festivals with art house films. This period, generally referred as New Turkish Cinema, represents a rebirth for the Turkish film industry. Reha Erdem belongs to a new generation of art house film directors of this period. Many films of this ongoing period developed either an emotional, philosophical, or spiritual approach to human and non human nature relations. This represents a prominent shift in ecological understandings compared to the early years of Turkish cinema. In the early films between 1950 and 1980, films mostly dealt with the environment for its importance as a surrounding and as resources for human life. In early years, there were mostly rural narratives that told stories of the villagers and their labor relationship with natural environment, questioning issues like water or land ownership and feudal traditions. While the early films portrayed human and non human nature relations in a more social context around the issues of livelihood, social rights, and national identity, recent films mostly frame that relation in a more personal context. What we can observe in many art house films of this period, such as in Reha Erdem cinema, is that the stories don't only evolve around human individuals, but non human entities have also presence in these narratives, not necessarily through an anthropomorphic portrayal, but in general through a nature based aesthetic. The films give non human nature a filmic character in company with the human and create a sense of wholeness. From an eco-critical perspective, I ask such questions. How do we observe natural environment as a filmic character in film narratives and aesthetic? How these films create a sense of wholeness between human and non-human? And how can we interpret this approach to human and non-human nature relations in its social context? Eco-criticism mainly focus on the sociocultural analysis of human and non-human nature relations, but above all, it's a critical thinking about humans as species. That's a prominent issue in Reha Erdem films, as he is mainly interested in portraying degraded human relations and values. We can say that his films identify these relations and values as unnatural by creating a tension between the references of anthropocentric mentalities and ecocentric impressions. His ecocentrism manifests itself in the mystical world he constitutes through the intuitive connection of his main characters to non human nature. I think this reveals a non hierarchical, interconnected relation between human and non human and encourage a perspective that acknowledges nature's intrinsic value. For this talk, I take some examples from five films of Reha Erdem for discussion: Times and Winds, Cosmos, Jin, Big Big World, and Singing Woman. All these films take place in rural areas where one can be in contact with a natural environment that is exposed to little human intervention. These films are not interested in nature as a domicile, but instead nature as a refuge. Nature as a domicile is a place of livelihood, economy, and responsibility, but nature as a refuge is a place of psychophysical catharsis and mindfulness. Some films like Times and Winds and Cosmos and Jin touch on the domicile aspect, as we see villagers who have labor relation with natural environment. But the main focus of the films is positioning a pristine nature as a place exempt from degraded human relations. Films mainly reflect on the patriarchy, exploitation, and separation in human to human and human to non human relations. Reha Erdem chooses his main characters from women, children, and outsiders, and they are positioned as the victims of these separating human values. We follow the stories of a guerrilla girl in eastern Turkey running away from both the state and the organization in Jin, two orphans running away from abuse and violence in big world, a homeless outsider looking for shelter in a small town in Cosmos, and women trying to survive and find place among men's hunting domination in Singing Woman. And lastly, children who are forced to grow up soon according to patriarchal values in Times and Winds. These main characters are the ones that are able to build up an intuitive connection with non human nature. Pristine nature is portrayed as a non hostile environment, opposite to the human made world. The tension between the forest and the city in big world, wild mountains and bombings with shutouts in Jin, children's world with adults' world in Times and Winds, outsider and insiders in Cosmos, and men and women in Singing Woman represent the separations based on human created values. In these films, the concepts of danger and uncanny are mainly related to masculinity and patriarchy. In Jin, Singing Woman, and Big World, abuse and sexual harassment towards women are foregrounded. In Times and Winds and Cosmos, the director shows the reflections of patriarchy in a wider context. We see how patriarchal relations shape children's development in Times and Winds, and how that leads to social exclusion in Cosmos. On the other hand, films position these vulnerable characters as the agencies of interconnection with natural environment. Mind-nature bond that is created through these characters can be seen as a way of, quoting Val Plumwood, breaking the dualism that serves to legitimate domination, like in reason, emotion, culture, nature, or man and woman. In that sense, Erdem's films are mostly interested in androcentrism as a core problem and hints at ecofeminist ideas that take the domination of nature as part of a comprehensive ideology of domination. Films portray the struggle to survive of the oppressed and exploited women, children, or outsider characters, and how they take refuge in natural environment against the harm and danger caused by patriarchal human society. In Times and Winds, all along the film, Ömer, an elementary school student, wants to kill his authoritarian father with childish attempts like leaving the window open in his bedroom to make him get cold and sick. As he secretly opens the window at night, the director shows the old pine tree looking at the window as a witness with a long detailed shot. In the next scene, we see Ömer sleeping under the same tree as if he is integrated with the soil and pine needles. Ömer is one of the kids in this film. The story evolves around three kids, their rite of passage and conflicts with the adult world. We see these kids sleeping in nature's bosom in several identical scenes throughout the film. These scenes follow the situations where the children are forced by the adult world and exposed to maltreatment or injustice. Natural environment devoid of human intervention is a place exempt from patriarchal hierarchy and authority. The children who are yet out of this adult world are the only human actors of human and non human interconnection. They don't feel belonging to this patriarchal system, they rather act and feel like a part of nature. Childhood is identified with untainted nature and an intuitive perception of life, whereas adulthood represents human created social values. In that sense, the film creates a perception of nature that deep ecologists define as similar to the implicit philosophy of a child. According to the philosophy of deep ecology, childhood is a time when one can be in a state closest to nature. Arne and many eco-philosophers draw a parallelism between a child's intuitive perception of nature and the idea of ecological self that becomes convergent with the interest of the rest of life. Reha Erdem's main characters in all his films are either kids or childish, naive adults. Jin and Big Big World follow teenagers who are left alone in life and trapped in between infancy and growing up. And the lead characters in Cosmos and Singing Woman are naive, childish grown ups with mystical powers and unconditioned attitudes that are abused by and excluded from society. As one example, Cosmos is a mystical stranger. He is an outsider coming to a small town community. We see him running down from the snow covered mountains towards the town. He talks like a prophet and sometimes uses a language that seems like bird sounds. Town people value and look after him in the beginning as they discover his mystical healing abilities. Then this turns into exploitation. He forces the limits of his abilities to help them. His nature also degenerates with an impulse to reply to all demands. He is a healer, but he suffers as he heals. He makes sounds like birds screaming, gets weak, and falls down whenever he replies to people's needs. He is finally excluded from the community when he is no longer useful for them, accused with taking advantage of women, as he has an unconditioned way of behaving beyond gender stereotypes. In the last scenes, we see him running back to the mountains. Since from the beginning, people are suspicious about him because they can't understand his mysteries. He is constantly under the risk of being excluded, yet they easily take advantage of his skills. Cosmos is like the agency of the earth itself, searching for belonging in a utilitarian and otherizing system. Reha Erdem likes questioning the rules of the adult world, as he mentions in an interview. His unique way of doing that is going after a child's intuitive perception of nature. That reflects an awareness of the living world and creates a sense of wholeness between human and non human. The adult world is defined mainly with patriarchal domination, as said before, and non human nature entities are among the abused, along with the leading characters. We see prominent scenes in most of these films, such as dying horses in Singing Woman, animals getting hurt by bombs in Jin, street dogs that are maltreated, and animals slaughtered in a slaughterhouse in Cosmos. Mystification is a significant way of creating a child's intuitive perception of nature in Erdem's films. That is foregrounded mostly through an animistic spirituality and a trans-species communication between leading human characters and animals. Animals occupy an important screen time in his films, and in some cases, along with the screen time, extreme close ups strengthen their presence. Erdem's films don't depend on long dialogues. In general, atmospheric sounds are more prominent than the human speech throughout his films. The long-standing silences and limited dialogues appear to be opening space for the voices of non-human nature. In both Jin and Big Big World, we see the wilderness and animals as cohabitants. Reality and imagination intertwine with scenes where characters have psychophysical experiences in natural environments, like sleeping in nature's bosom that becomes a shelter and a path to inner world, or coming very close with wild animals and witnessing their unrealistic gatherings. Along with animals, long shots of plants occupy a prominent screen time in Erdem's films that give non-human nature a strong presence in their own rhythm, as much as the human characters. In a sense, they are perceived as participants and witnesses to the situations. Some scenes also highlight the presence of natural elements such as wind or rain with long detailed shots of plants and landscape. Esma in Singing Woman and Cosmos from the same titled film have mystical healing powers, and they both have special relations with animals. Esma is the only one in the island where she lives who can see a deer that is unlikely to be seen there. In a scene, we see Esma with Mariam, a homeless, abused girl who finds refuge in this island, as they chant together in the forest with sounds similar to animal sounds around them. With parallel editing, the director creates a harmonious interconnection between these women and the animals, as if the animals join the chanting or vice versa. On the other hand, Cosmos makes sounds similar to bird screams at times when he connects with people for healing them. He communicates with the girl he falls in love with sounds that resemble a bird singing. In the scene of their first intimate meeting, reality and imagination intertwine as we see them flirting and chanting like birds, and they seem like flying together through editing. In Big Big World, Zuhal silently communicates with non-human nature in the woods. Director uses the similar sleeping in nature's bosom scenes in this film as well. She encounters with animals, feels the trees, spends time with a corpse as she feels everything as alive in the forest. She says that repeatedly in a scene where she feels physically ill. She finally has miscarriage, a metaphor of taking the pain resulted from the abuse she experienced out of her body. Erdem, in a way, creates a mystical world that belongs to his vulnerable characters interconnected with non-human nature, trapped in the real world. The main characters, as victims and outsiders of the society, are like adopted by nature. While attracting attention to separating human values, do these films create another form of separation between wilderness and human society? Positioning nature as a place of healing against the damages of modern human society can be considered as a romantic approach, in terms of aesthetic attitudes and detachment from a strict rationalism towards nature. However, as generally observed in romantic approaches, can we define the representation of non human nature in these films as an act of otherization? Can we say that nature is suspended from the everyday life in these films? I think Erdem's films reflect on both the separation and connection between human and non human nature. The nature and nature connection is suspended from the everyday life of the human society that is based on separating values. Nature as a domicile, meaning people having economic and livelihood relations with natural environment, doesn't change this fact, as this suspension is primarily mental. However, Erdem's main characters, victims of this society, have an intuitive connection with non human nature. There's an interconnection here, not an otherization. Films attach importance to the mystified nature connection more than how nature is perceived in current human society. In a way, they encourage the viewer to think which relation is real and what is natural. Erdem's films develop an approach to nature that has a social aspect with grounding in spirituality. They combine an earth based spirituality with a critique of society and degraded human values. In that sense, his approach, I believe, is more a critique about separating human values than a separation based on the otherization of nature. To conclude, we mystify nature and nature connection because natural environment is more and more excluded from our living spaces and daily lives. There are some current empirical studies showing that nature experience is mostly defined as spiritual by majority of participants, and other studies on spirituality and religion claim that nature spirituality is proliferating globally. Mystification of nature has similarities with sacredness of earth in pagan beliefs. This parallelism, after decades, is interesting but not surprising. Nature was sacred because its dynamics were fully unknown back then, and people were consciously dependent to natural elements and events in terms of livelihood and survival. Today, nature is still a mystery in many ways, despite the technocentric illusions of human species. However, the majority of people are now unconscious about the fact that they are still dependent to nature for survival. This loss of connection can be seen as a motivation behind the current mystification of nature and the increase in the spiritual tendencies towards nature, especially in this age of environmental crisis and worldwide struggles to keep this fact on the agenda. In case of Turkey, Erdem's mystification of nature and nature-based film aesthetic, along with many other art house films of this period, can be considered as a sensibility based on a need to reconnect with nature, which is lacking both in urban areas with aggressive concretion and constant exclusion of green spaces, and in rural areas with loss of livelihood and migration to cities, mainly since 1990s. In Turkey, 1990s saw rapid urbanization acts as the urban populations increased dramatically, especially after 1980s, with the effects of globalization in agriculture, politics, and economy. At the same time, environmental movements, along with other social rights movements, such as women's and human rights and peace initiatives, evolved to be an important part of civil society. State policies have also put the environment on the agenda, first Ministry of Environment was founded in 1991. Yet, unstructured and distorted understandings of development and economic growth, primarily related to energy policies, resulted in increasing environmental problems both in urban and rural areas in years. Also triggered civilian movements and especially locally driven campaigns. We can say that this rise in civilian environmental movements also encouraged the evolvement of an ecological awareness in some sectors of society. I consider ecological awareness as a sensibility towards non-human nature, acknowledging the value of natural environment as a living system. That awareness also includes the questioning of human relation to human and non-human. I think we can observe the reflection of this social agenda in new Turkish cinema with the emergence of an ecological awareness in some popular and art house films. Reha Erdem cinema represents a distinctive example in that sense, as his films place emphasis to the investigation and critique of society and human values, along with a determinant nature-based aesthetic. Thank you for listening.